So hi, everyone. We can start the event now. Welcome to this latest, and I would say very special, most special of webinars organized by the International Manifesto Group, in which we reflect on Through Pluripolarity to Socialism, a manifesto 1 year on. My name is Radhika Desai, and I'm the convener of the International Manifesto Group. As you know, the International Manifesto Group began as a bit of a discussion club. We have members all over the world, and we seek new members from more places all the time. We represent a substantial diversity of currents of socialist thought, and we meet roughly fortnightly, sometimes more often, sometimes a little less often, to hold Zoom events on major issues and events. We launched our manifesto a year ago, to be precise, on the 5th of October, 2021. And what a year it's been. It's been a year during which we have had a major war, the conflict over Ukraine, rising tensions over Taiwan, not to mention stepped up technology wars against China, the unended pandemic, the launching of AUKUS, mounting US foreign policy disasters amid what has happened over the past year. We've even forgotten about what was one of the biggest events when we launched our manifesto, namely the disastrous US withdrawal from Afghanistan. We've seen the manifest decline, economic decline of the West with the return of stagflation, the advance of the left in Latin America, political unrest in countries as diverse as Sudan and Sri Lanka, increasing assertion of countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, the boomeranging of Western sanctions against Russia, putting European governments on trial, and putting the very survival of the European Union and NATO in question. The US losing nearly all its allies in the Middle East and now waving the nuclear specter. I could make this list much longer. Just keeping up with the news seems to have become a full-time job. So how well has the manifesto stood up to this tumultuous year? This is what we are here to discuss. Our various contributors are here to start off the discussion, and their presentations will be followed by a wider discussion among us, so we may all reflect on the significance of what we have said in the manifesto and done as the IMG, and what we should say and do as we go forward. So let me just start by quickly listing out what I take to be our very core thesis, that capitalism is well past its use-by date, that more and more countries led by socialist China are standing up for international law and the original anti-imperialist purposes of the UN Charter, and against US exceptionalism, Western exceptionalism, NATO, and the so-called rules-based international order. That contemporary socialism, contrary to the end of history thesis, has a century-long record of resistance to capitalism, intervening at decisive junctures even to save capitalism's own skin, for example, by first saving it from fascism and then providing some of its major tools for the so-called socialistic measures that provided the foundation of the golden age. That in retrospect, it is clear that both capitalism and imperialism had reached their apogee in 1914 when the 30 years crisis first started. That the underlying capitalist character of Western economies first led it to crisis in the 1970s, and the application of neoliberalism since then has solved nothing and only made capitalism more predatory, speculative, and financialized. That the left in this era, thanks to mistakes going back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, not only failed to make any revolutions, but also ended up with the bargain of certain socialistic measures as domestic reform by signing up to anti-communism, and then later on signally failed to use the neoliberal era, which should have been a major opportunity for left mobilization to fight capitalism and fight neoliberal capitalism. So today we have a pathetic situation in which the opposition to the neoliberal establishment is coming from the right and not from the left. That the record of socialism so far underlines the truth that Marx and Engels understood very well, that socialism will be built not just by classes, but also by nations. And that the resistance of nations has led not to unipolarity, but to multipolarity and pluripolarity. And that the Western and US reaction against this has not led to a peace dividend after the end of the Cold War, but instead to rising Western and US militarism. And that this militarism is essentially leading more and more countries to move away from the West and ally with that camp, which is going to which is essentially led by socialist China, and essentially putting them on a path to pluripolarity, which will eventually is the only path to socialism. So those are some of the things we have argued. And thinking about how these theses have fared over this past stormy year, I was reminded of what Marx said in an 1847 speech on free trade. He was speaking at a time when capitalism was only nascent, and he said that the advance of capitalism would give its laws, which embodied and expressed all the most astounding contradictions of capitalism. It would give these laws an increased force, a surplus of truth. I believe this past stormy year has certainly done just that for our manifesto. It has given our manifesto an increased force, a surplus of truth. So let's turn to our contributors now. We will begin with Professor Chang-En Fu. Professor Chang-En Fu is the head of is the principal professor at the Cass University, and he will start us off today. And he will speak to us. He has sent a video, and Dr. Zershu Liu will read his speech in English. So go ahead, Zershu.
Okay. Last year, I believe in September, I spoke in the launch meeting of the manifesto, Through Pluripolarity to Socialism. The manifesto has a clear theme, profound ideas, magnificent momentum, and it clearly articulated the history, current status, and future of world socialism. The international situation over the past year has continued to confirm the fundamental point of the manifesto. And in the following, I would like to share with you a few points of mine on the development of socialism in the world for the sake of discussion. First, the severe situation of the COVID-19 pandemic in the West and in the world has led more people around the world to realize the advantages of socialist system and its way of governance. So far, Russia has exposed dozens of US biological labs in Ukraine. Scientists from various countries have suggested that coronavirus might have originated in the United States, while the United States, however, has evaded all these questions. And it is now the third year of the pandemic, and no one knows how long it's going to last. As the manifesto rightly says, as ramshackle capitalism responded to the pandemic, inevitably, symbolically, metals nosedived. Whether they denied it or forcibly pitted lives against livelihoods, their responses to the pandemic amounted to the social murder of millions and induced economic crisis of historic proportions. In contrast to the dual bad situation in the West, socialist countries like China, Vietnam, Cuba, and North Korea follow the human rights principle that prioritizes people's life and health and has achieved the dual goal of epidemic prevention, control, and economic development. Second, Russia's special military action triggered by the West has led more people in the world to realize that socialist system and policies are peaceful in nature. The Russian-Ukrainian war is triggered by NATO's eastward expansion and Ukrainian semi-fascism. Russia is fighting against US Western hegemony, revealing dozens of US biological labs in Ukraine, opposing Ukraine's brutal violence against the Russian nationality in Ukraine, and throwing a blow to the autocratic regime of monopoly bourgeoisie in Ukraine that prohibits the dissemination of Marxist and communist ideas and banned the Ukrainian Communist Party. For these reasons, The Russian Communist Party and other progressive forces in the world are supporting the Russian action against the US and Western hegemony. This has led more people around the world to realize that imperialism is war, as Lenin famously put it. Third, the US and its allies in the West are promoting hegemonic and unilateral warm war and new Cold War, which has led more people in the world to support the progressive forces of the world as represented by China and Russia to team up and oppose hegemony. The new pattern of international politics today is characteristic of an imperialist alliance in confrontation with Russia and China, with the decline of US hegemony. Since Biden came to power, the United States has been actively building a trilateral security partnership with Britain and Australia, a quadrilateral security dialogue with Japan, India, and Australia, a Five Eyes alliance with UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and an Indo-Pacific economic framework. The US and UK plan to transfer weapon-grade nuclear materials to Australia to build nuclear submarines, and a series of nested small circles have been formed on the basis of the Group of Seven, and Britain followed the United States closely, as well as Japan. As the manifesto points out, today that struggle stands at a perilous juncture, this long-brewing crisis brought to a boil by the pandemic, manifestly making a poor contrast to China's manifold successes. The leading imperialist nations seeks to lead other imperialist and lackey countries in the new Cold War against China. Never has so much destructive power has been concentrated in so few irresponsible and desperate hands to wield against so great a majority of the world's people and peoples with an objective interest in socialism. Fourth, the outbreak of economic crisis in the West in 2008, the severe pandemic and conflict between Russia and Ukraine have accelerated the rise of the East and the fall of the West in the world economic structure, and has encouraged more people around the world to support the development of socialist China and the idea of cooperation and development in a community with a shared future for mankind. China will continue to work with friendly countries to build the Belt and Road Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS, the Group of 77, and the Global Development Initiative, and increase funding for the Global Development Promotion Center of China International Development Cooperation Agency. This will greatly improve the development of national economy and people's livelihood in developing countries, including socialist countries. And the last point I want to make is that 2020 marks the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Soviet Union, which is worth commemoration and continuous study. As the manifesto rightly points out, the indefinite closeness of our tasks requires that we secure the legacy of the Soviet Union and all attempts to build socialism high settled with a historically just balance sheet of their achievements, limitations, and failures. These are a few points that I want to share with you here today. Thank you very much. I look forward to more detailed discussions.
Thank you very much to Professor Chang En-fu, and thank you to Dr. Zhe Liu for reading us Professor Chang En-fu's remarks in English. Our next speaker will be Professor Buzgalin. Professor Alexander Buzgalin is a professor of economics at Moscow State University and is also the coordinator of the organization Alternatives. He's a member of the organizing committee of the Russian Social Forum and focuses on problems of Marxism's actuality under current conditions and the resulting challenges for left movements. So, Sasha, please go ahead.
I'm very, very glad to participate in this wonderful debates. It's a very big event. Sometimes we cannot understand how we are important. And I am very honest when I said this, because the situation is extraordinary. Necessity in new theory is extraordinary. We cannot make new mistakes. In past socialist forces made some mistakes. We had enormous debates about theory, and sometimes we made the not best choice. That's why now responsibility of theoretician is very important. It's like a responsibility of the constructor of airplane. Will it fly or will it collapse? It can be very good pilot, it can be very good workers, engineers, but if constructor, creator of airplane was wrong, it will not fly. A few ideas, because it's very short period of time. You are absolutely right in the manifesto that capitalism can change his form. We have new step in the development of capitalism, and the nature is the same, but with big changes. What kind of changes? First of all, it's necessary to take into the account again and again contradiction between productive forces and production relations. Now we again, after 70 years of stagnation, have a necessity and opportunity of qualitative jump in technologies. And we don't have this jump. New technologies are used for nothing, for financial speculations, for show business, whatever. So we must tell this. Capitalism cannot accept and develop mass creative activity of the people. We have a barrier on the development of these opportunities of personality in each country, not only in developed countries. It's first point. And we have, because of that, second idea, which I want to stress, we have opportunity of development of new forms, new directions of socialization of capitalism. I want to stress, for me, late capitalism is period when capitalism cannot develop without elements of socialism, even communism. We have free of charge distribution of information, absolutely free without limits. This is element of communism. We have free of charge education, healthcare. We have necessity to solve ecological contradictions, and for that we must have again all world, all mankind as actor. This is elements of new quality of life. And capitalism must develop these elements of future in order to survive. This is a contradiction of modern capitalism. He must kill himself in order to survive, if I can say so. Because capitalism doesn't want to kill himself, even for survival, it will develop, and it is already developing, elements of refeudalization. We have a reactionary trend of the history. Instead of progress, we have regress. History is going back, unfortunately. And we have decades of this opposite direction of not evolution, but involution. We have forms and appearance of this, which everybody knows, starting from permanent wars, new wave of militarism, even new forms of imperialism, when not only capital is actor, but countries fighting for territories. It's feudal model of empire to create big territory, not to create basis for your own capital, not only create basis for your new capital and so on. And also internal relations, which include more and more semi-feudal forms of subordination and exploitation of labor. So this is challenge. Either qualitatively, partly qualitatively new forms of socialization because it's still capitalism, or refeudalization. If this contradiction will not be solved, we will have a revolution. And this revolution can be, in the same time, uprising, which will lead to defeat of progressive forces and enormous regress of mankind, including fascism. And I think we must mention in manifesto problem of revolution. 30 years ago, everybody was talking only peaceful, only democratic methods of movement towards socialism. I'm sorry, but today's situation shows that it's very probable to have global wars. And in this situation, only peaceful, only democratic methods will not work. I'm not happy about it, but this is the reality. So we must talk about this. And if we are not ready for progressive revolution, it will be counter-revolution. We have also, this is big question mark, new form of subject of progress, of qualitative changes of society, both reforms and revolution. Industrial proletariat, yes. And you mentioned, and this is very important, that industrial proletariat, again, is the most massive part of working class in the world. But at the same time, we have new social actor, and I want to stress this social actor. Creative workers of social sector. People working in education, in healthcare, in art, in many other spheres in social sector, in state sector, in many countries. And they have new conditions of labor, new contradictions, new problems, and they can be also very important part of movement forward. And maybe last idea, which I want to stress. Idea of so-called market socialism, a relation between market and socialism and so on. It's permanent discussion. I remember 40 years ago, nearly 40 years ago, I had the discussion with Ernst Mandel, one of the best theoreticians of Force International. And I asked Ernst, why you are speaking again and again about market and socialism? This is so old topic. Let's discuss new problem. And he said, Sasha, 50 years will pass and you will discuss the same. He was right. And I want to stress in connection with China, with other countries which are moving in this direction of combination of elements of market and socialism. First, you are in the process of combination of capitalism and socialism. And not simply capitalism, but late capitalism. Forms, methods, elements of relations which you are using are forms, methods, and relations of late capitalism. It's modern financial system of capital. It's modern system of corporations, of exploitation of labor, and so on. And new forms of socialism. And here problem is direction of transition. Definitely, it is impossible to jump towards socialism without elements of capitalism inside future society. It's all the idea of Karl Marx. But what is important? We are moving towards negation, dialectical negation, not abolition, but dialectical negation of these relations, step by step, and creation of new society. Or we want to keep status quo forever. In other words, this mixed society with elements of capitalism and socialism. This is forever, or we have future. Future which will be another type of social economic relations than we have now. And if we have future, we must start to build this future today, now, and see our society in China, in other countries, especially it is important for Latin America, and see modern society, today's society, as a road from past to future, not a status quo forever. And this historical approach, dialectical approach, is extremely important. That's why postscriptum. Dear comrades, let's remember about dialectical method. I'm sorry, but I know a little bit Western Marxism, Eastern Marxism, post-Soviet Marxism. We have a few scholars who use dialectical method in practical theoretical work, a few. And this is crime, I can say. We are postmodernist and positivist in our methodology very, very often. And if I'm wrong, I'm happy. So let's be dialectical. Let's be really thinking to the future and understanding complexity of the contradictions and tragic character of these contradictions, which can lead to mass violence. And we must be ready to give our response to this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sasha, for those excellent reminders of the legacy of Marx, and also, of course, the way in which you and your colleagues have assimilated that in the post-Soviet school of critical Marxism, which I think is really very important and interesting, and very important for our manifesto as well. So thank you very much. Our next speaker is John Ross. John Ross is Senior Fellow at the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University of China. Since 1992 and the publication in Russia of Why the Economic Reform Succeeded in China and Will Fail in Russia and Eastern Europe, he has authored, which was a very prescient article, he has authored over 500 published articles on China's economy and geopolitical relations. He has many followers on China's Weibo, the Chinese equivalent of Twitter, and his articles on China's economy have won several prizes in China. He's the author of 2 best-selling books published in Chinese, The Great Chess Game and Don't Misunderstand China's Economy. His new book in English is China's Great Road, Lessons for Marxist Theory and Socialist Practices. John, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, let's look at the manifesto 1 year on and test it against the big events which have taken place. For me, this is one of the most important places in what we may call the global north, which has managed to maintain its bearings amidst the events which are taking place. And what are the events which are taking place? They are the rising curve, an increase in escalation of military aggression by the United States. Let's look at what has taken place. 1999, the first stage was the United States increasingly militarily attacked developing countries. So we had the attack on Serbia, in the bombing of Serbia in 1999, the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, the invasion of Iraq in 2003, the bombing of Libya in 2011, the US intervention in Syria from 2011 up to the present stage. But now the United States has passed a new qualitative threshold. That is, the United States has decided that it will take the risk of a war, a confrontation with a major nuclear armed state. That is the United States' creation of the war in Ukraine. Because there should be not the slightest doubt about this, that the United States and its attempt to expand the war expand NATO into Ukraine is responsible for this war. Indeed, the United States has been prepared to plunge the European continent into chaos as a result of that. We have a major war in Europe. We have rapid inflation. We have economic crisis and political crisis in several European countries. What does the United States wish to follow this up with? It wishes to impose the same upon Asia. That is by its attempt to create the same type of conflict around Taiwan against China. Fortunately, the Asian states, because most of them are in the global south, are more sensible than the West European states and have refused to go along with this. So far, the US attempt to create a equivalent crisis to the situation in Ukraine in Asia has been a failure. But that, of course, doesn't mean that the United States is going to give up. To be frank, the majority of the left in the global north has totally failed in this test. It has, in the worst cases, supported the policies of the United States. That is the so-called policy of defending Ukraine, of supporting Ukraine, etc., of proclamations of new theories, such as the sovereign right of Ukraine to join NATO. What a wonderful thing for the sections of the left to be putting forward. And it has failed to see the dynamic which is taking place. The Manifesto Group is one of the places which foresaw these events and has not done so. And that's why it's done. And there are increasing forces. These are scattered. But nevertheless, they are in the global north. We can contrast this with the situation in the global south, which shows quite a different picture. In the global south, the overwhelming majority of countries and the overwhelming majority of humanity has refused to go along with this policy of the United States of provoking the war in Ukraine. It has refused the sanctions. It is, in some rather surprising groups of people, have told the United States to go to hell, such as, for example, the Indian government, of which many people here will not be great fans. The Saudi Arabian government, which possibly is one of the few governments which would have even less fans amongst the people here, because the United States is carrying out such an attack on the people of the world that it's resisting. We also see the situation in Latin America, where fortunately, not merely has the left held out, but it is advancing. We all know that Venezuela and Cuba, despite the blockades and the sanctions, etc., have maintained the path of building socialism and continuing to orient towards socialism. And the left has been advancing in the last period in Latin America. After the disorientation after 2014 with the collapse in the commodity price boom, the US thought Latin America was going to resume being its backyard. Well, it hasn't done so. There have been many successes which have taken place in Latin America. For the first time, a leftist candidate, not extremely radical to be quite honest, has become the president of Colombia. The coup in Bolivia was successfully defeated. And we have an event at the end of this month, which of course can actually change the geopolitical situation significantly. That is, if Lula is to win the presidential election in Latin America. So fortunately, other forces are joining into the heroic resistance which has been put up to Cuba by Cuba and Venezuela, and some other forces. I don't have time to list everybody. And the Manifesto Group has been totally orientated to that. Then also we see something which is taking place at the present time in China, which is China's not gone backwards. China has gone forward. Anybody who follows the situation in China shows there is now at the present time, China has achieved the greatest success in eliminating poverty in human history. In the number of people, even by World Bank standards, 853 million people have been lifted out of absolute poverty. In China's national criteria, absolute poverty has been eliminated. China has also stood up with very skillful foreign policy against the attacks which are being made by the United States upon it. For example, in the South China Sea, the United States have been trying to create a totally artificial crisis, because in the South China Sea, the countries around the South China Sea want to get on with peaceful economic development. Fortunately, unlike the chaos in Europe, they're growing rather well. Their population is developing. I'm not a great fan of all of these regimes. I'm not a big supporter of monarchy, for example, if we take some of the countries here. But nevertheless, they have had the good sense to refuse to go along with what happened in the United States. So we see, therefore, a very sharp division in the world. I'm afraid, amongst large part of the left in the global north, confusion, retreat, and apologies for the United States. Let's call it by its right word. The Manifesto Group has been one of the forces internationally that has not gone along with this due to the orientation which is contained in the manifesto. And those forces in the global north should not believe that they are isolated. The forces in the global south, in China, are continuing to stand up against this US offensive and to go forward. So that's why it's good reason to have a discussion and celebrate 1 year after the production of the manifesto. We're not powerful enough by ourselves to change the situation, but you have to fight under whatever circumstance you find yourself. Unfortunately, some very powerful forces in the world are on the same side as us. So that's the perspective we have to adopt, and therefore congratulations after 1 year is in order. Thank you. End.
Thank you so much, John. That was really great to hear, very clear as always, and concise, and I think to the point. Our next speaker will be Carlos Ron. Carlos was born in Venezuela and is in Venezuela, is Vice Minister of Foreign Relations for North America, and currently serves as the president of the Simon Bolivar Institute for Peace and Solidarity Among Peoples. He has also served as Venezuela's chargé d'affaires in the United States from 2017 to 18. He represented Venezuela before the United States of America in 2014 to 18, and then in the federal, and then represented Venezuela in Brazil. He's been advisor to the Office of Presidential International Relations, coordinator of the research program on regional integration and multilateral agreements at the Miranda International Center. So, Carlos, please go ahead. Carlos, are you there? Yes.
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 Sorry,
no worries.
I seem to be having connection problems exactly when I'm about to speak.
Oh dear.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity. And again, let me just express our congratulations for the 1 year anniversary of the Manifesto Group, for all the work that has been put into place and that will continue to be taking place, and our recognition and of course our solidarity. Looking at the text a year after, you know, and coming from, well, there's several things that we want to say, but you know, coming from a place, you know, in Latin America where sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Sorry about that. I'll try once again. I'll leave the image off just so that.
Mm-hmm.
So I was saying, coming from Latin America, from from the anti-colonial and revolutionary tradition of Simón Bolívar, you know, who believed in the equilibrium of the universe concept as a concept which basically says, you know, the international order where different continents constituted gravitational centers, or what we would call today the poles, with enough strength to evenly maintain their relations and their interests. It is this necessity of this belief that led President Hugo Chavez to, you know, call for this concept of pluripolarity, which is very well explained and reinforced within the manifesto. So coming from this perspective, you know, I think we are seeing that in truth, history was not dead with the victory, as our friend John Ross just reminded us of, the victory of President Petro in Colombia recently. We saw a very emotional and very important moment, which was during his swearing-in ceremony. He stopped the ceremony for 10 minutes, right when, you know, he actually
Carlos?
So sorry, friends. saying we saw this important moment when President Petro was being sworn in. Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, that the sword of Simón Bolívar was brought in to the ceremony. And what is remarkable is not that fact in itself, was the reaction of the people. And because the crowd was very engaged and lively and very excited, and because it is what it represents. And again, what we see is that the current forms of imperialism have wanted to take away from us our identities, our histories, the history of our struggle. I'm sorry. I don't know if you want me to try one more time. I'm sorry. I'm sorry about this. It's not my fault.
Let's try one more time. And if it doesn't work, then we will go to somebody else and maybe you can come back in later.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. And again, apologies. All this to say, the importance that we are here from Venezuela, for example, I think looking at the manifesto, looking at the current challenges that we are faced with, this idea of the expansion of NATO, this idea of the defense of this rules-based international order, but whose rules and under what conditions, which is very clearly stated in the manifesto that is basically a denial of the rights of the third world.
I think maybe what we should do is let Carlos maybe fix his internet connection, and for the moment we will go on to the next speaker, but then we will come back to Carlos to hear the rest of his speech. So our next speaker is Jenny Clegg. Jenny Clegg is an independent writer and researcher, former senior lecturer in international studies and longtime China specialist. She's also the author of an important book, China's Global Strategy Towards a Multipolar World, which was published in 2009. She's an activist also in the peace and anti-war movements. So Jenny, please go ahead.
Thanks, Radhika. Yeah, rereading the manifesto, we can see, I think, a very strong sense of being on the brink of a momentous historical change. Nevertheless, the turn of events over the Ukraine conflict blindsided many and giving much pause for thought. I've been looking again at pluripolarity and multipolarity. Pluripolarity sees a variety of states, from imperialist to socialist, arising state by state from the contradictory processes of uneven and combined development as external conditions interact on internal class dynamics. But the whole is more than the sum of the parts. What's important is the overall configuration of power, which sets out a strategic terrain with patterns of interstate contradiction and coordination, which change as the underlying balance of power shifts. Multipolarity captures the shift from US hegemony towards a five-pole pattern of the EU, Japan, Russia, and China, as well as the United States, which since February the 24th, the US has dramatically sought to reverse, damaging Russia, subordinating the EU and Japan in readiness to turn directly to China. Pluripolarity and multipolarity are complementary, but the latter, I think, opens up wider directions and future scope, a game of Go, playing different parts of the board rather than a chess game of head-on confrontation between two state players. I also would now distinguish between a multipolarity in itself and a multipolarity for itself. A multipolarity in itself, the objective conditions, involves other states likely strong rising regional powers moving in with their own agendas to build or defend national strength where they perceive a vacuum left by US decline. Multipolarity for itself, the subjective conditions, involves conscious process. Rather than a series of uncoordinated national agendas, it involves a coordinated developmental effort which at once searches out opportunities to gradually undermine hegemonism while shaping through trial and error alternative arrangements to try and find the way to win without fighting. It's not for nothing, I think, that China consistently embraces the notion of the present era as one of peace and development. It does so by keeping the whole game of Go in view and looking to the long term, calculating possible moves ahead. I think that the manifesto now needs to bring the strategic element more into focus, the issues of war and peace, the crucial importance of the UN coming out of 2 world wars as a radical turning point in the path of capitalist development, with its recognition of national sovereignty and equality, opening the door to multipolarization. Nor should we forget how the peace movements of the 1980s and the international opposition to the Iraq War also formed poles in the emerging multipolarity, influencing the strategic balance. And right now, of course, the urgency of the struggle for peace and nuclear disarmament. I also want to say something about neoliberalism. The manifesto shows very clearly how this lies at the root of the current malaise. But when we see how the US is now using bullying and economic coercion to restructure the energy and arms markets, to control and monopolize new technologies, as well as weaponizing finance, is neoliberalism still the correct term? And right now in Britain, as crisis deepens, divisions in the Tory party are like cats on a hot tin roof, surely reflecting differing fractions of capital. And there are strategic issues here, I think, which neoliberalism as a general term does not really capture. And finally now, IMG seeks to celebrate and to explain the real achievements of socialism, but the history of socialism is also full of mistakes and some terrible mistakes. IMG then must not be too generalizing, but must maintain a critical perspective. It must encourage debate and allow nuances to be explored in a respectful way, whether in addressing the non-aligned trend, the dualities of the Ukraine war, and indeed of Putin himself. Sectarianism is the bane of the left, and Mao Zedong saw doctrinarism and dogmatism as the worst of all errors. IMG should aim to be a broad forum of anti-imperialist and socialist discussion and should avoid taking partisan positions which would squander its opportunities to build bridges of dialogue between anti-imperialists in the global north and global south. Going forward, from my own context in Britain, socialist demands, conflating into calls for nationalisation, seem to exist in a vacuum detached from anti-imperialism and the international context. How to link the cost of living protests and calls for a ceasefire and peace negotiations over Ukraine, it seems the biggest challenge that we face. Internationally, I think we also need to take account of contradictions within counter-hegemony and within the global south. And lastly, to return to the question of internal and external, towards the end of the document, the manifesto talks about advances towards socialism in the near future involving international struggle as much as domestic class struggle. And it then says the key is seizing control of the state from capital, that is on a state-to-state basis. How do these two aspects of the international and the domestic fit together? And in relation to the 6 points at the end, how do these play out internationally as well as domestically? And here I think that China's initiatives on global development and global security deserve our particular attention.
Thank you so much, Jenny, that you've given us a lot of food for thought. And I think as I listen to all of you, I'm thinking more and more that we should publish all of these statements on the manifesto website. I think that would be a really good thing to do. So thank you for all those excellent points. Our next speaker is Ajamu Baraka. Ajamu is the national organizer of the Black Alliance for Peace, and he was also the 2016 candidate for vice president on the Green Party ticket. Please go ahead, Ajamu.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure and really an honor to be part of this very important conversation to commemorate the one-year anniversary of this very historical document, this blueprint for how we move forward. We believe that this manifesto definitely captures the essential historical and contemporary contradictions and provides a framework for understanding, a framework of understanding for advancing popular and socialist peoples and nations. We also understand that this process of how we arrive at socialist transformation is a process that is under debate. We understand that there are some who still believe that a peaceful transition is possible. We hope that to be the case, but we understand we have a position that suggests otherwise. I'm representing the Black Alliance of Peace. The Black Alliance of Peace is a multi-tendency anti-imperialist organization situated within the Black community. I have to move now. Within the revolutionary forces, within the Black revolutionary forces within the U.S. We are situated, we're based primarily, it's a national formation, but our orientation is situated in the South among what we refer to as the African working class and the colonized people of the United States of America. So we see ourselves as a part in the North, but politically connected to the global South. That is our perspective. That is the politics we bring to these processes. We argue that it's absolutely necessary for revolutionary forces in the global North in particular to understand this current period, to understand that the struggle for socialism is an intensifying struggle, and that it requires addressing the contradictions we see among what we refer to as the liberal left in the North. The consistent providing ideological cover, justifications for imperialist penetration, imperialist moves has to be confronted. There can be no hesitation, no shyness on the part of Northern forces to address these contradictions, and that worry about the smearing campaigns that result from that. They have resurfaced all of these cute little terms, tankies, and all of that. We can't allow that to undermine our politics and the kind of solidarity that we need to develop in order to defeat this imperialist monster. So we say we're going to continue to go forward and raise the contradictions. One of the issues that we want to just touch on very briefly as we take this opportunity to be in dialogue with all of the fantastic activists and scholars on this call is a situation that's developing with Haiti, and the contradictions that is developing among the liberal left, and the questions it raises regarding the role of the United Nations and nations that we are talking about today. The situation with Haiti, of course, very briefly, we all know that the U.S. has been moving toward providing a justification for intervention. The Biden administration will float a resolution at the Security Council probably on Monday, calling for a intervention based again on this bogus concept of humanitarian intervention the responsibility to protect, in light of the fact that the people of Haiti are resisting and calling for non-intervention. They are calling for self-determination and democracy. But the paternalism and the racism of the liberal left is such that they have fallen prey to this racist trope that the Haitian people are unable to govern themselves, and that people in the North know better than the Haitian people themselves what their needs are. We are going to call for on Monday, that is the Black Alliance of Peace, a rejection of this resolution, and we're going to call on either Russia and China to basically veto this attempt. And we're going to take a very aggressive position on this, friends, because we're not going to allow, once again, any position in which these two powerful nations pretend that they don't understand the consequences of their non-action. The memory of Libya is fresh in our consciousness. So we're going to call on these nations to veto this action, to stand with the Haitian people, and not allow another advancement by U.S. imperialism. So the U.S., EU, NATO axis of domination continues, is not going to be defeated by just shouting at imperialism. We share the concern and the position of our friend who presented this morning, Professor Buscali, that while we love to see a peaceful transition, it's quite clear that the U.S. commitment to full spectrum dominance, their military first positions suggest that they are prepared to blow up the entire globe before they peacefully give up global hegemony. In the U.S., and I'll finish on this, we see that the kind of collaboration between the northern liberal left and the U.S. bourgeoisie is resulting in this justification, this support for these kinds of aggressive policies, including the aggressive repressive policies now being directed at the African revolutionary movement. Many of you have heard about the FBI raids on the African People's Socialist Party. So we are saying to everyone that this struggle is going to intensify. Those of us who are in the belly of the beast, if you will, in the middle of this empire, we are calling on folks to be vigilant, to support these struggles, and for us to all understand that for us to defeat this monster, it's going to take a horrific struggle. But with the work of this International Manifesto Group providing us the theoretical frameworks and the international connections, there's no doubt that we will be successful. So thank you so much for allowing us a few minutes to share. And we have circulated this among our hundreds of members, and we have been debating elements of this. And we thank you for this contribution, and want you to know, as we are in the middle of the United National Anti-War Coalition's Week of Action against the war in Ukraine, and the BAP Month of Action against AFRICOM, that we will continue to struggle and to fight. And we have no doubt that in the end, the people will be victorious. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ajamu, for that ringing endorsement. We couldn't have it from better quarters. So, and I really love your analysis as well. And thank you also for mentioning Haiti. Pardon me, my dog is barking, but I will very quickly introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Keith Bennett. Keith is an active member of the International Manifesto Group and a consultant specializing in Chinese and Korean affairs. He's co-founder of Friends of Socialist China, which is a very important website, which everybody should check out, and is the deputy chair of the Kim Il-sung Kim Jong-il Foundation, KKF. Keith, please go ahead.
Right, yep, coming. Yeah, thank you, Radhika. The late British Prime Minister Harold Wilson reputedly said that a week is a long time in politics. And certainly that might seem to be the case for the former UK Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng, you know, the one who turned up in Washington for the annual meeting of the IMF, declaring he wasn't going anywhere, only to have to leave early to return home for the dubious pleasure of being sacked. But if a week is a long time in politics, it's already 1 year since we launched our manifesto, Through Pluripolarity to Socialism. Of course, in the broad sweep of human history, a year is far less than a blink of an eye. But perhaps we should reflect more on Lenin's famous observation that there are periods of years when nothing seems to happen, and then there come days into which years are compressed, and we seem to be headed more in that direction. Two things occupied particular attention when we were drafting the manifesto. One was the global COVID-19 pandemic, the variegated response to it, the contradictions that it had brought to the surface and exacerbated, and the social, economic, and political crises it had triggered. The other was the chaotic US, British, and NATO withdrawal from Afghanistan and the ignominious collapse of the puppet regime they had sought to leave behind. We noted that the response to COVID-19 on the part of the socialist countries had been exemplary, and that has continued to be the case, whether in China, Vietnam, Laos, Cuba, or the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, despite the fact that the last two named countries have labored for decades under crippling and asphyxiating sanctions and blockades. China, Vietnam, and Cuba have not only carried out exemplary policies at home, they have been providers of much needed aid, primarily to developing countries, but also to developed countries, in the finest traditions of working class international solidarity. By being the very first country to introduce lockdown measures, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea registered not a single case of COVID for over 2 years, and then, thanks to a huge nationwide mobilization, rapidly suppressed the virus when it finally entered the country. As the manifesto stated, no wonder the ruling Communist Party of China celebrated a proud centenary in July 2021. As we meet today, the 20th National Congress of the Communist Party of China has opened in Beijing. It will not only set the scene for the next 5 years of China's socialist development, but also map out more generically the route from the achievement of a moderately prosperous society and the complete elimination of extreme poverty, achieved just before the first centenary, that of the party, to the realization of a modern, powerful, and prosperous socialist country in all respects by the time the nation marks its second great centenary, that of the founding of the People's Republic in 2049. What an inspiring vision, and what a contrast to the increasingly obvious dysfunctionality of the main bourgeois parties in the major capitalist countries, be it the United States, Britain, France, Italy, or wherever. China's dynamic zero COVID policies have literally saved millions of lives. Yet the more lives they have saved, the more hysterically they are denounced in the imperialist world by politicians, the media, and so-called talking heads alike. Government ministers in Britain, or at least people who were government ministers the last time one looked, it really is becoming hard to keep up here, constantly tell us that COVID is over. As supposed proof, one reason cited is that Britain is the only European country with no COVID-related restrictions left in place. Such a great achievement. But rather than constituting a victory over COVID, it simply gives us the dubious honor of having, in Engels' entirely apt description, the most socially murderous government in our continent. 2 days ago, the Office of National Statistics estimated that 1 in 37 people in the UK currently has COVID, a rise from 1 in 50 a week before. It further highlighted the danger of a COVID and flu twindemic this coming winter. Turning to the imperialist retreat from Afghanistan, a process that unfolded with extraordinary rapidity as we were finalizing our draft, the chaotic and at times pitiful scenes that unfolded at Kabul, particularly around the airport and the road leading to it from the city, reminded one of nothing so much as events on a day that some of us are old enough to remember, a day in spring 1975 when the helicopters fleeing from the roof of the US Embassy marked the moment when Saigon became Ho Chi Minh City. But whilst the return of the Taliban undoubtedly marked a defeat for US imperialism, it did not represent a victory for progressive humanity in the way that the victory of the Vietnamese communists, supported by the Soviet Union, China, and the entire socialist camp did. What the defeat in Afghanistan means for the global struggle against imperialism and the world balance of forces is naturally a topic for study and debate. Certainly, as with Iraq, only more dramatically, it shows that, despite decades of effort, heartless brutality, and trillions of dollars, US-led imperialism is not capable of solving a single problem, cannot achieve any sustainable victory, cannot subdue a people who rise in resistance, even if they are mobilized around an anachronistic ideology, are equipped with simple weapons, and lack significant external support. This is a stark and demonstrable fact that should be noted by people in any and every country suffering under the heel of imperialism. At the same time, I would argue that those comrades who argued that a prime purpose of imperialism's hasty retreat was to position itself more strategically vis-à-vis its two principal adversaries, China and Russia, appear to have been largely vindicated. NATO's proxy war against Russia, which it seems determined to fight to the last Ukrainian, combined with the new Cold War against China, which has only intensified under the Biden administration, whether viewed from the perspective of Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in early August or this last week's new national security strategy, means that the danger of nuclear war has never been greater. This is something that should vitally concern every human being on Earth. Our manifesto noted, Rosa Luxemburg famously feared that the alternative to socialism was barbarism. Today, however, it is human and planetary annihilation. This is true whether we look at it from the perspective of the threat of nuclear war, zoonotic pandemics, of which COVID-19 is certainly not the last, or the looming climate catastrophe. The existential threats staring humanity in the face require socialist solutions. This is the context in which we have developed and are conducting our work. I believe we have a unique role to play as a global network of socialist and Marxist scholars and activists from different traditions and backgrounds, but who have arrived at a common but not identical position on the need to stand firmly on the soil of anti-imperialism and to recognize the indispensable and leading role of the socialist countries. Periods of great crises lead to profound political realignments. Nothing illustrates this more starkly than the road from the outbreak of war in Europe in the summer of 1914 through the October Revolution to the founding of the Communist International. Today, the international left, in an inevitably confused, contradictory, and partial way, is embarked on a realignment and recomposition no less fundamental than that of our forebears a little over a century ago. And the same interrelated questions are at its heart: whether to oppose imperialist war wherever it is waged, whether to support all those who fight imperialism, no matter the banner under which that struggle is waged, and whether to give resolute, wholehearted, and unqualified support to any and every country, no matter where and no matter how, where our class, the working class, takes power and sets out on the long and difficult road of building a new society, a socialist society. Let us all echo the title of the great Paul Robeson's autobiography, Here I Stand. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Keith. That was just so well thought out, and I thought so well put. Wonderful set of reflections on what we've done and what we still need to do. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Dr. Oleg Barabanov. Oleg is a Russian historian and political scientist and is the program director of the Valda International Club. He's also professor at Moscow's famous MGIMO University. So Oleg, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Radhika. Are you hearing me? It's okay?
Yes.
Also, let me pass my congratulations to all of us, because we see that in this year, the International Manifesto became really a very important theoretical document, but not only theoretical document. It became a solid base for practical activities, for practical reflections. And in that sense, one of the key preliminary aims to write and publish the International Manifesto was absolutely right in that sense. And also, we see that today the new National Congress of the Communist Party of China is started in Beijing. There already were some preliminary reactions of various international media. I've seen some of the newspapers in the US, in the UK, and they are quite irritated by the Chairman Xi Jinping's speech. And it means that the global left movement, surely headed by the China's People's Republic now, is a real factor of pluripolarity, is the real factor of balance in the global world. And the irritation of the neoliberal media, the irritation of neoliberal politicians, which will rise in these couple of weeks during the Chinese Congress, will show exactly that. And it's also very symbolical for me as a Russian, that about a month ago we had a death of Mikhail Gorbachev, the last general secretary of the Soviet Communist Party. And the comparison of the Soviet and Chinese path to the contemporary socialism, to the socialism of the 21st century is very characteristic, because with the Soviet Union and with Gorbachev as its leader, unfortunately, we saw the self-destruction of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. We saw the self-destruction of the country. We saw the self-destruction not only of the political regime, but of all social achievements that the Soviet Union made during 70 years of its existence, and especially in 40 years after Stalin, when the social policy of the Soviet Union was more active and more real, as I would say. It all was destructed with Gorbachev, and many people after that, both in Russia and in the West, was saying that now the idea of socialism is dead, absolutely. It became only in the historical archives for 20th century and no more. But now with China, we see that there could be and there is another path for developing socialist ideas, to developing Marxist ideology, to connecting it with real national interests. And it's very, very good, because now, as also many colleagues said in our conference today, we all see the development of and the rising of popularity of left liberational ideas in Latin America, in Africa. Sure, the very strong factor to the future development of the left liberational ideas is the Black movement and other similar movements. And I see that now we can see in the future of the global left movement with good feelings. So, and for sure that no death of socialism, no death of Marxist ideas is happened. And I'll try to be brief, just a short point on the current events in Russia now. Because you all know that me and many other Russian speakers and the International Manifesto platform, we were very skeptical on Vladimir Putin's so-called openness to the left-wing ideas. We were saying that it was and is a typical playing of the right-wing regime with who is trying to attract more supporters abroad among the left intellectuals, among the left parties. I remember that several years ago, Russia was a host of the International Youth Festival organized by the anti-imperialist youth from the 40s or 50s. And there were clearly two paths within that global youth festival. One is sincerely left organized by foreigners, and another one is a kind of simulacrum organized by the Russian presidential administration. And now, what was interesting in the official Kremlin's position to the left, that now in the situation of the war dangers, with the situation of the started mobilization within Russia, Putin for the first time mentioned Vladimir Lenin not as a problem for all contemporary problems in Russia, but with rather good words. He said that now we see that we must keep heritage of our three former leaders, the Emperor Nicholas II, the last emperor of the empire, Stalin, and Lenin. And I was quite surprised that for him it was the first time to speak about Lenin with good intentions. Still, I'm not sure that he is sincere, that he is not continuing to only to play with the left ideas, but and we see that also that the position of the left forces, the real left forces in Russia is quite difficult now. But at least for the moment, what I can see is that the war dangers provoked more openness from the official Kremlin position to the left ideas, to the name of Vladimir Lenin, to the, I hope, to the heritage of Vladimir Lenin. And many Russian economists are quite openly started to speak at the Russian television now on the ideas to restore the state economy, or the ideas to restore the economic, at least the economic, not political socialism, and so on. So we are now in Russia in a quite interesting position on the brink between the right and the left. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oleg. I think hearing your remarks is really fascinating, and I think you are certainly right that, or at least certainly I can't help feeling that circumstances are certainly pushing Russia in a very progressive direction, no matter the intentions of the leadership. So that's really fascinating. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Dr. Gabriel Rockhill. Gabriel is a philosopher, cultural critic, and activist. He is the founding director of the Critical Theory Workshop and professor of philosophy at Villanova University. He's published 9 books as well as numerous scholarly journals and scholarly and journalistic articles. Most recently, he has published in English Counter History of the Present. He has also published Interventions in Contemporary Thought in 2016 and Radical History and the Politics of Art in 2014. So Gabriel, please go ahead.
Thank you, Radhika, and thank you to the entire International Manifesto Group. It is incredible project. And I'd like to, I guess, begin by highlighting the strengths of it, because my approach to rereading the manifesto, given that I'm a practical person and a materialist, was to think not only about the manifesto as an isolated text, but more specifically about a year of webinars, public education, and collective scholarship. And one of the things that really struck me in both rereading the manifesto and then thinking back on this last year is that it's a very rare environment. John Ross foregrounded this, and I think it's extremely important. I myself am situated in the global north, and there's almost no platforms for ecumenical, historical materialist analysis on the basis of critical support for socialist projects and actually existing socialism that exists. And it's also a very high level of conversation within the Anglophone world. Moreover, it's truly interdisciplinary because you bring in economists, historians, sociologists, but you also have a very wide understanding of what constitutes intellectual work. So these aren't only academics by any stretch of the imagination. Of course, you have political leaders and journalists and activists. And so there's a real sense that what matters as intellectual work is not one's job, but one's vocation, and whether or not one is dedicated to mapping and understanding the major fault lines of contemporary class struggle. It's also resolutely internationalist, of course, you know, from China to Ukraine to Brazil to Canada and beyond. And the content, one of the things that I particularly like about the material manifestation of the IMG is that it's always a digestible format. So the point is to connect with people and give them resources, not to simply either pontificate or go on at length with kind of academic presentations. And so overall, I've been very, very impressed by IMG's ability to produce high level and high quality, collectively resourced roadmaps of the state of contemporary class struggle in order to provide, in addition, a broad international audience with reliable coordinates for practical action. And so in the rest of my comments, I'd just like to highlight 3 points that I think are important or that jumped out at me, both rereading the manifesto and thinking back on this last year. The first is the role of the professional managerial class. On page 10 of the manifesto, you highlight that there's been an expansion of the professional managerial stratum under neoliberalism as production was offshored, centralizing management, engineering, design, legal, marketing, advertising, et cetera, in many of the Western countries. This professional managerial layer, you go on to say, elevated high above the mass of working people, enjoys many privileges, including access to private and public resources. Now, there are also, I think, among other things, this professional managerial stratum is tasked with the mind management of the masses through the bourgeois cultural apparatus, and that it is therefore a driving force behind so much of the dominant ideology within the imperialist core, including its anti-communism, its social chauvinism, and hence its pro-imperialism, as well as identity politics and other kind of obscurantist ideologies like postmodernism, deconstruction, and things like this. And so I think a further analysis of this class stratum would be very welcome, beginning with its historical formation and the global political economy that produced it. The history of imperialism, as we know from Lenin, would be very key to this analysis because he identified the material basis for social chauvinism. And that is that the extraction of monopolist super profits from peripheral societies created a labor aristocracy among the European working class, resulting in their embourgeoisement. But a further evolution of this through the course of the 20th century has been the development of this managerial stratum of the working class, particularly in the post-World War II era, that would go a long way, I think, to explaining how it's been shored up by agencies like the Central Intelligence Agency, by support for what they call the compatible or the respectable left, meaning the non-communist and pro-imperialist left. So much of this has been done, of course, by drawing on the opportunism of the professional managerial stratum. And one of the other great insights from Lenin is that it is perfectly obvious that social chauvinism's basic ideological and political content fully coincides with the foundations of opportunism. So a greater investigation into the opportunism and the way in which it's structured by global political economy and therefore orients this professional managerial stratum to a pro-imperialist position would be very welcome. We've seen this most recently, of course, with many of the pseudo-leftists. I'll give a shout out to Slavoj Žižek, who are completely on board with the pro-imperialist project being driven by NATO and the United States. The second point that really jumped out at me in rereading the manifesto was the issue of fascism and what we've seen over the last year, but also, of course, this has a deeper history. There are some references to fascism. It's a theme that's come up at times through the webinar, but it has not been as centered as some of the other topics. I think it's extremely important, given the circumstances that we're currently living in, that we understand the history of fascism, the fact that it was not defeated in World War II, but rather recuperated by the imperialist forces and redeployed internationally by Western intelligence services in an ongoing war against communism. And the obvious growth of fascism around the world is related, of course, to capitalism's inability to overcome its internal crises, as well as its failure to defeat its ultimate enemy, which is socialism and the global working class movement. I'm sure most of us know that in 2021, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution condemning Nazism. And of course, the US and Ukraine voted against it, while a few countries, mainly US allies, ended up abstaining. It has also come out, as Etivio Boron, who I know is affiliated with the IMG, just recently detailed that there were internal documents that have been leaked that demonstrate the plans for the US use of Ukraine in a proxy war against Russia and, of course, ultimately China, predated the war itself by years. And so a further investigation into this deep history of the US imperialist core using fascist forces as its ongoing war against communism, I think is extremely important. Of course, this goes back, Douglas Valentine, one of the leading specialists on the history of the Central Intelligence Agency, has written that the CIA has been developing fascist assets in the Ukraine for some 70 years. And we know that the Ukraine is an international hub for this global project. Moreover, we also know that fascism is on the march in the imperialist core, right? We see this, of course, in the country that I'm currently based in the United States, but we've seen it across Europe. And in fact, after I wrap up my comments, I'll share, if I can, 2 maps of Europe in 1988 and Europe in 2022, where we see the disappearance of the red countries in the East, and we see fascism on the march from Orban to Meloni to, you know, the Le Pen movement in France, even though it hasn't taken power, is still a very powerful organization, and so forth. So we need to understand what fascism is, how it's rooted in the history of capitalism, and in particular moments of capitalist crisis, and how its principal enemy is socialism. And we have to also study the history of how to fight and win against fascism. I'll mention just very briefly in passing, there was a 2019 resolution by the European Parliament that's very important to know about, and it's gotten a lot of discussion within the European left, but not so much, at least that I've seen, within North America and beyond. And that is a resolution that basically solidifies a revisionist position that equates fascism with communism and, quote, condemns all manifestations and propagation of totalitarian ideologies such as Nazism or communism. So the position of the European Union is explicitly anti-communist and explicitly revisionist in identifying fascism with communism. The last thing that I'd say is that there's a series of laudatory goals that conclude the manifesto, all of which I completely support. But they leave me with a fundamental question, and that is, how can we best practically implement or achieve some of these goals? And I think that while discussions like the ones that we're having are extremely important to this orientation, we also have to find ways of practically connecting them even more concretely to important organizations that can build collective power, parties, unions, and various organizations. So for me, moving forward, a crucial question for the early 21st century, and this again is from my perspective within the kind of global north, is that of socialist reconstruction. How can we, as inheritors of many parties and organizational structures that have an unfortunate history of social chauvinism in certain cases, or reformist agendas in others, how can we, in moving forward, further develop parties and organizations that actually build working class power in the struggle against imperialism, the struggle for peace, the struggle for socialism? And in order to do that, I think that we have to really confront the anti-state, anti-party mantra that is the dominant ideology of the professional managerial stratum within the imperialist core, and arguably even more broadly than that. And so I'll conclude by saying that if we don't want to condemn ourselves to being canaries in the coal mine, singing beautiful songs of liberation until it all blows and the lights go out. We need to be working to develop powerful, practically oriented working class organizations that are anti-imperialist, pro-peace, and aimed at saving the planet and people before it's too late. Thank you.
Absolutely fantastic, Gabriel. I couldn't agree more with your wonderful 3 points. And I think you've just recruited yourself onto our liaison committee. So I think that you're absolutely right. We agree, and we have been working to some extent towards it. But of course, being an entirely volunteer organization, we also have some limitations. But you're so right. That's exactly what we have to do. And the scenario, the word, the way in which you put it is exactly right. And actually, I should remember that Camilla Escalante also sort of said, you know, we've got to stop talking and start doing. And I think we've absolutely got to do that. Great. Thank you so much. We go on to our next speakers. And let me just say that we have about a handful of more speakers, 3 or 4 more speakers left. And then we will have some open discussion so that members of the audience who would like to add their thoughts will have a chance to do that. Our next speaker is Sarah Flounders. Sarah is a longtime activist and author based in New York City. She's the leader of the United National Anti-War Coalition and the International Action Center. She's also the author of numerous books, including Capitalism on a Ventilator, The Impact of COVID-19 in China and the US, which she co-authored with Lee Siew-hin, and NATO in the Balkans, Voices of Opposition, co-authored with Ramsey Clark. Also, her latest book is Sanctions, A Wrecking Ball in a Global Economy. So Sarah, please take the floor.
Thank you, Radhika, and thank you to the International Manifesto. Happy anniversary in this year in which the world has changed. We're celebrating a project, a document written just a year ago. Is it relevant? Yes, because it's clearly taking sides in a global struggle and siding with every country and movement trying to break free of decaying imperialism. It's looking at emerging developments. The manifesto is partisan, takes sides, so it's better prepared to understand the new developments and to immediately respond. And this has been a year of developments. The US-dominated unipolar world is unraveling at the seams. Now, the International Manifesto begins with an interesting historic comparison. They explain the year following the release of Marx's Communist Manifesto was a tumultuous year of worldwide revolutionary activity. Now, this past year has not been a year of revolutionary upheaval, but it has been a year of unexpected, unpredicted upheaval. The International Manifesto Group launched Through Multipolarity to Socialism in October of 2021, and they couldn't have imagined this year. The present expanding NATO war on Russia is not in the manifesto. It wasn't being discussed. It burst upon us less than 3 months after the debacle of the long US war in Afghanistan that ended in ignominious defeat. Now, a seismic shift is sending shockwaves through the global economy. We are on the cusp today of the biggest global capitalist crisis in history. This will change everything. It will force millions into motion. Their survival is at stake. And the French strikes are the first glimmer of what's coming. The well-established capitalist disorder, dominated by US imperialism and in place since World War II, is now on such shaky ground. According to the IMF, all economic indicators point to a severe economic contraction in 2023. The Federal Reserve is shutting down the US and the global economy with rate hikes. In comparison, China's cohesion and continued socialist construction is a game changer in world terms. China has become the biggest threat to the imperialist world order. 2/3 of the world's countries today trade more with China than the US. US strategy to encircle China with missiles, bases, aircraft carriers, disruptions and interferences in Hong Kong and Xinjiang. US sanctions are so sweeping they threaten to bar every form of technology to China. US corporate rulers are united, Democrat and Republican, and they vote almost unanimously against China while voting billions of new arms to Taiwan. The US-led West is waging war against Russia over Ukraine while threatening another war with China over Taiwan. Nuclear war has never seemed closer. What they call decapitation drills just recently held in South Korea against the DPRK. So in all of this, the manifesto represents, as it says, many socialist traditions and a new sense of collaboration, of learning from each other and taking stock of a radically different world. The manifesto recognizes the Soviet Union's demise set socialism back, but was not the end of socialism, only the end of socialism's beginnings. And the road to socialism, communism, is long. The manifesto described a world divided, a complex world full of shifting new alliances, but new potential. On one side are the countries struggling to assert national identity, sovereignty, gain a foothold of development. Not all are building socialism, but they're struggling to break free and develop global relations and exchanges. Imperialist pressure on each effort at socialist revolution continues, but also attacking every effort of economic and political progress. Large developing capitalist countries such as Brazil, India, Russia, Turkey are re-examining their options and past alliances. The BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation confirm that there's new possibilities. And Latin America and Africa are embracing this and are in upheaval, and they're reviving. China's development and trade challenges the rounds of new sanctions that punish every defiant country, whether Syria, Cuba, Venezuela, DPRK, Korea, or Yemen, with blockading medicine, oil, food. But suddenly, the global South has the potential of more favorable trade and infrastructure. This opens liberating potential. Now, in this global divide, on the other side is a gang of predators, literally predators who can only survive by drinking the blood, raiding the resources and the labor, dominating global markets. US imperialism leads this pack of hungry predators. The unipolar world is dominated by the IMF, the World Bank, and NATO, the US commanded military alliance. Any infraction brings destabilizing economic sanctions and regime change operations. And that is the world that is being challenged. Into this mix, the US and the EU and their allies have an army of propagandists who claim that they represent freedom and human rights and democracy, that regime change operations are popular uprisings, these color revolutions. China's refusal in all of this to go along with the sanctions, especially on Russia, it's a game changer globally. Other nations can now stand up because they have an alternative. And what a surprise. The entire global South has stood up to these sanctions. To the shock of US war strategists, no countries in Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, and most of Asia accepted the US, EU, UK sanctions. The open defiance of so many countries and major trading blocs is a stunning confirmation of the weakening hold of US economic power. China's productive capacity, its economic growth, is a very real threat because capitalism is all about markets. Capitalism must expand, and the US and the Western Bloc are no longer the main producer or the main lender. What a blow. US global hegemony is threatened, and the unipolar world's days are numbered. The clash is it's larger than just a gas pipeline. The US economy is focused on military production. It's the largest exporter of weapon systems. It's an essential prop to the economy. It's the endless capacity to destroy, but not to rebuild. So in closing, I want to say that US imperialism is unable to match China's Belt and Road development plans. More than 138 countries have signed on for new ports, railroads, industrial hubs, and low interest loans. China's Belt and Road development loans are more attractive than US weapon systems and the harsh austerity plans that are attached to the IMF and World Bank loans. So these contradictions are growing. 90% of all trade in the world is done in US dollars. And the US policy now of raising interest rates strengthens the dollar against every other currency. It's going to make food and essentials far more expensive everywhere in the world, not just in the US or in the West. It will hurt most of the poorest people of the world, where 85% of the people of this planet live, in the global South. This is the world we face. Capitalist overproduction is a permanent feature of capitalism. It drowns and overwhelms their system, but it means hunger, not plenty, for billions. Our task is to do everything in our power to make this decaying, corrupt, brutal system ungovernable. We need to stand with and defend the many forms of resistance that are emerging. They represent the future, and they are coming forth. A better world is in birth.
Thank you, Sarah. That is a wonderfully optimistic thing to say in these times, which often seem so dark, so clouded over. But thanks for pointing to the silver lining, of which we hope we are a part, however small it may be. Thank you. So we go to our final three speakers. Alan Freeman is next. He's co-director with me of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group here at the University of Manitoba. He was an economist with the Greater London Authority between 2000 and 2011, where he held the brief for creative industries and the living wage. He's also the author of The Ben Heresy, a biography of the British politician Tony Benn, and has co-edited 3 books on value theory. He's honorary life vice president of the UK-based Association for Heterodox Economists and vice chair of the World Association for Political Economy. Alan, I see you are already starting, so please go ahead. We can't hear you, Alan, if you are speaking.
I can't work out how to make
Okay, we can hear you now.
I can't work out how to make this graph move on. I can only display it, but I'll do what I can. I want to follow on from what many of the speakers have said. I won't mention names because pretty well everybody has said something that allows me not to say it. I am of the view that Sarah just stated, which is we are on the verge of a tremendous knockdown crisis in the North. And this is going to have very large implications. And I want to put this in the context of the following question, a very simple question. Why is the left in the North so small? And will that change? And I want to raise a question which has occurred to me in the course of writing about this, which is what has happened, which I think we should address. I think the Manifesto Group should address this question. What has happened to the original project of Marx and Engels to create an international of working people? What has happened to the slogan, workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but their chains? Well, imperialism happened to it. That's the simple explanation. But I think more than that happened. If you look at the history of the attempts, there was the first international, which founded essentially on the split between the Bakuninists and Marx. There was the second international, which was the mass international, coming after the Great Recession of 1870, that gave birth to sort of modern socialism and modern communism as a world movement. And we should not forget that without the Second International, I'm not sure the Bolsheviks would have existed. because the Bolsheviks were a faction within the social democracy. So that what happened is communism emerged out of social democracy. I mean, I come not to praise social democracy, but to bury it. But you have to recognize one's origins. So there was a historic split in the world movement at that time. And the way that communists since then have oriented themselves is to suppose that the 1924 conference of the Comintern, which is probably the highest point of understanding of the relation between imperialism and socialism, was creating a basis to correct that. So what emerged then was the Third International, the 27 points and so on, the Communist International. There was then, divisions, as we know, within the Third International, the project of creating the Fourth International, which, as far as I can make out, although I was a member of it for many years, has simply become an instrument of imperialism. What I think we haven't looked at is the fact that the Third International was dissolved. So there has been, for 70 years, no mass organization of working people worldwide. It has not existed. The incubator, therefore, for working class struggles remains confined to the national sphere. We don't operate on the international sphere. Now, when you have countries such as Socialist China that are actually promoting messages that have a resonance amongst working people the world over, of course, that in a certain sense acts as a surrogate. But I don't think there is a substitute for creating a mass international organization of workers. And our task in that is phenomenally important, because we have to create we have to attempt to create mass organizations of propertyless people in the global north that recognize what is set out in the manifesto. That's an immense task. And of course, we can't do it on our own. And I think the points that were made by Jenny about avoiding sectarianism is extremely important. We're not a new party. We're not a Fifth International. We're a forum for discussion. We're a forum for encounter from different currents the world over, in which I think that, the priority that we have is that we want the global north to learn from the global south. So is that possible? I think it is. This first graph I've put here, I mean, I've shown this before, but I think it's phenomenally important, is what is driving this whole damn thing is that imperial capitalism has been declining since 1960. Now, the name given to this, I think, has been referred to as, the long decline. But I think people don't realize how long it is. And it is now at rock bottom. Now, what does that mean? It means, because the United States is driving this whole thing, but all countries are in decline. This is an average of the whole of the North, is that the only way that the United States of America can maintain its world dominance is by driving everybody else down. That's the source of the military attacks that Keith mentioned. That's the source of, that's why, as John said, they're going to this immensely risky provocation of actually going for an all-out war with a major nuclear power, probably the major nuclear power in the world apart from the US, maybe the major nuclear power full stop, which is an unbelievably risky undertaking. Why are they doing it? Because they have no choice. That's the crucial thing to realize. I think one of the things that the left is very confused about in the North is they envisage some kind of return to normality. There will be no more normality. We are living in normality now, and it only gets worse. So the US is smashing into a very disoriented population, which has lived on the mythology of social democracy, or, which I think is just a branch of liberalism. Which is that basically we are superior to the rest of the world, we're richer than the rest of the world, therefore we must be better, and therefore we just carry on doing what we're doing. I think the reason is quite simple, people are not suffering. I'm sorry to say this, but I did a little calculation of the number of poor people in various parts of the world by the standards set by the United States. Now, if you take the US poverty line, which is $27.80 a day, I believe, the percentage of the population of sub-Saharan Africa, which lives below the poverty line of the USA, is 92%. So the North American population is not being treated well, particularly Black people, people of color. But compared with what the situation is in sub-Saharan Africa or the Middle East or South Asia, Latin America, there is no comparison. There is no comparison. And that is what is driving multipolarity. Why is Saudi Arabia and India and countries like that finally coming together and forming some sort of very disparate, economically disparate bloc? Because the US dollar no longer offers them a way forward. So therefore, the US, and Michael Hudson has pointed this out, is not merely attacking the global South, it's attacking Europe. Europe is in the target, is in the gun sights. And, you know, the whole Nord Stream thing is all about basically, you know, as the original project of NATO was described, you know, keep America in, keep Russia out, and keep Germany down. And I don't think there's any partner in Europe. I think this is the whole Liz Truss phenomenon, the Boris Johnson phenomenon, is sort of crazy belief that you can be a kind of 53rd state. There's nobody in Europe that America is bailing out because it hasn't got the resources to do it. It can't bail anybody out. So I think that you will get a very major crisis in the North in which austerity will be at the front. Now, what's the relation between that and war? Scott Ritter has said this in some of the platforms I've shared with him. He says the real test for the anti-war movement will be whether it links the battle against the attack on its own people that is now going to, which is starting now, it's unfolding as we speak. Will they draw the connection between that and the war? That's the real test. If they draw that connection, and there are signs that in some places, some of the Czech mobilizations were very interesting because there was people linking the war to austerity. And what it first takes the following form. We're not against the war, but we're not willing to pay for it. And we should be open to such currents. We shouldn't say these currents are not true anti-imperialists, not true Bolsheviks. I think we have to be extremely open. We have to get in debates with them. And in particular, those debates must ensure that we move them away from the fascist positions to which they're now being drawn, as has been pointed out. But I think that there's possibility that the necessity is of mass currents in the North that say we would rather have our own situation dealt with properly than have this war. And if you get that, I think you're going to begin to get a very different arrangement to that, and we have to be ready for that. We have to be open to debate with forces who are not going to come as you know, agreeing with everything in the manifesto, but are beginning to question the war. So I think that's an extremely important next stage of our development. The final thing I want to say is this: what's happening in the global South? I think what Oleg said is what I actually expected. I mean, it's one of the things I've been quietly saying to me. You can't run a war without communism. And one of the things that people don't realize about the history of the United States is that whenever it went to war, it went communist. The whole of the United States economy during the war was taken over by the state. Now, it was taken over in a very peculiar way because the state was actually run by the corporations. So they set up, you know, sort of the War Management Board, which is all the big corporations in America, and they organized the state to tell people what to produce, to organize a command economy. You can't run a war without a command economy. And that's why essentially, I think one of the most significant things now going on in Russia is actually the move towards command economy in very important parts of production, which are essential to military production. The next step, of course, is to organize a command economy and what's essential to human life, which is what you're going to have to do if you want to maintain the unity of the population. So let's see where the talk about Lenin begins to lead in that respect. But what is the paradox is this, is that it's back to the question of working class unity. Up until now, even the communist world, even the communist world was divided. So the Sino-Soviet split, 1956, meant that even though 80% of the world's population lived in countries that were split by imperialism, the fight between them consumed them more than their unity. Now, the question now is, if you get this move towards, you know, increased influence of communism, seeing the sense of what China's doing in the global South, will the unity which is being found, which is a pluripolar unity, hold? I think it will. It has to. If it, I mean, you know, if even Modi and Saudi Arabia think it's more useful to be working with Russia, then, you know, I wonder what it would take to split it, although the, you know, United States is working on everything it can possibly do, as we know. If that comes about, the situation is actually relatively favorable for people in the North simply waking up. You can't carry on living in a bubble of self-deception forever. All history shows there's a point. You know, the history of the German Revolution of 1917, 1918, which everybody should bone up on, shows that there's a shifting moment in a war when the population says, we have been lied to, we have been deceived, we have been worked over, and we are so angry we are not taking it. It's not for nothing that Lenin spoke of the epoch of wars and revolutions, because war is the mother of revolution. You only have to look at what happened in Portugal in 1974, which was the only European post-war revolution that there has been, when the war in Angola and Mozambique was creating such catastrophic losses on the army that the generals themselves went over to socialism, and you had the Carnation Revolution and all the rest of it. So I think there are a number of circumstances which are very favorable. They're not yet being realized. That's why we are very, you know, small. But I think we have to be ready for our influence to get rapidly larger. And in order to do that, the key, what I see as the absolute key thing, is to be open to new developments. The one thing that I hope we do not descend into is a flurry of, how can I put it, position taking, in which we think that the key thing we now have to do is get everything right. I think we've got everything right. We've got the main things right, okay? What we now have to do, and we've got a solid record of working together, of learning to manage our differences. We've created a very good functioning editorial board. We need a lot more money, though, so don't forget to give us money. Because, you know, we have no big funders. We have no Frankfurt School Institute to support us. But we've got that. Now the thing is to be open. Now the thing is to tell the world what the new things that are going to start going on with this austerity. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Alan. Okay, so our last two speakers, Carlos Martinez goes first. Carlos is an independent researcher and political activist based in London. His first book, and by the way, Sarah mentioned this in her speech, and I should say that we in the manifesto stole the expression from Carlos' book. The title of Carlos's book, which is At the End of the Socialism, was just the end of the beginning. Carlos's book is called The End of the Beginning, Lessons of the Soviet Collapse, which was published in 2019. His main area of research is the construction of socialist societies, past and present, and he co-edits with Keith Bennett, who you heard earlier, Friends of Socialist China, and is a co-founder of No Cold War. So Carlos, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Radhika. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating today. Now I'm sharing a panel with a large number of people who know significantly more than me about geopolitics. And therefore, I'm going to limit my remarks to a particular area, which is the question of climate change and environmental questions in general, how they're covered in the manifesto and the developments that have taken place in the last year since the manifesto was released. So the manifesto talks of an ecological emergency of climate warming, pollution, and biodiversity loss, rendering our planet increasingly uninhabitable. And it points the blame for this situation directly at neoliberal capitalism, which has, quote, turned everything the earth offers humanity gratis into plunder and profit. And I'm afraid to say that in terms of what neo-capitalism has been doing, this analysis still holds entirely true. Indeed, the situation is in many ways worse than it was a year ago, in spite of a great deal of rhetoric and the passing into US law 2 months ago of the Inflation Reduction Act, which includes climate commitments that Joe Biden considers to be sort of the landmark success of his presidency to date. And it is unquestionably the US's most important set of climate commitments thus far. Unfortunately, that's not really saying very much, and it's still nowhere near the type of unprecedented action the world needs from the US, which of all the major countries has the highest per capita emissions in the world, and which has contributed a full quarter to global cumulative carbon emissions, in spite of having just 4% of the world's population. Even if the US meets its targets under the Inflation Reduction Act, which is pretty doubtful, let's face it, then in 5 years' time, it will still be generating significantly less renewable energy than China will generate this year. But anyway, it's more fruitful to look at what the US and its allies are actually doing, as opposed to what they say they're doing or what they will do. Most obviously, the US is driving NATO's proxy war against Russia, which is nothing short of disastrous in environmental terms. In order to punish Russia, to consolidate the Western military, economic, ideological alliance, and to generate profits for the US's domestic fossil fuel industry, the Biden administration has been heavily promoting sanctions on Russian gas and pushing Europe towards reducing its reliance on Russian energy in the long term. You might hope that at least that might mean some sort of commitment to renewable energy. It doesn't. It actually means, one, a major increase in US exports of fracked shale gas to Europe, two, a return to coal for much of Central Europe, three, ramped up drilling for oil in the North Sea, four, a renewed interest in fracking in Britain and elsewhere. All of these are significantly more damaging in environmental terms than using Russian natural gas. Hydraulic fracturing, or fracking, is an unproven and likely extremely dangerous technology which potentially causes earthquakes, water pollution, and serious leaks of methane, which has 40 times the greenhouse effect that carbon dioxide does. And even if everything goes according to plan, well, shale gas is still a fossil fuel. And to get it from North America to Europe, it has to be liquefied, stored at minus 70 degrees Celsius, and then transported by ship. Obviously, this whole process is extremely costly, both in financial terms and in energy terms, certainly much more so than using existing pipelines that are running from Russia through Europe. Meanwhile, Germany, for decades a poster child of the renewable energy movement, has started reopening its coal mines. Its coal use is up 17% on last year, corresponding to a decrease in natural gas imported from Russia. As most people know, coal is the worst of the fossil fuels, associated with twice the carbon emissions of natural gas. And if there isn't enough farce and irony in this whole story so far, well, it's precisely the German Green Party that's most hawkishly pushing these policies as part of their overall anti-Russia strategy. As is so often the case, the expression that comes to mind is, thank goodness for the existence of the People's Republic of China. A couple of months after the release of the manifesto last year, China announced some historic commitments, achieving peak greenhouse gas emissions before 2030 and reaching carbon neutrality by 2060. This is entirely in line with what the US and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have recommended for developing countries, and will constitute by far the fastest transition away from fossil fuels for an industrialized country. And, let's face it, China is generally in the habit of keeping its promises. It already looks like it will hit peak emissions before 2030, and it's already exceeding its targets for renewable energy generation. Coal has gone from 80% of China's power mix 20 years ago to under 50% now. That's actually a smaller proportion of the power mix than in Australia, obviously a rich and advanced country. The Belt and Road is getting greener and greener, with coal projects cut out and with a big emphasis on renewables. Actually, China is responsible for a third of all renewable energy investment globally. It's the world leader in electric buses, world leader in electric trains, world leader in electric cars. It's by far the global leader in the installation, generation, and consumption of solar power, wind power, hydropower. No country's done as much as China in terms of reforestation and afforestation. In the last 4 decades, forest coverage has doubled from 12% to 24%. Now, what allows this progress, of course, is the class structure of Chinese society, in which power isn't
Carlos, you just froze.
Green New Deal, which seems, completely marginal, sort of pie in the sky in this radical left idea in the West, is pretty close to what's actually happening in China. Unlike the US, unlike Britain, unlike the EU or Canada or Australia, China spends significantly more on renewable energy and environmental protection than it does on its military. Meanwhile, as the rich countries continue to fail to meet their commitment agreed in Copenhagen 13 years ago to provide $100 billion annually in climate finance to poorer countries, China in that same time has conducted hundreds of foreign assistance programs related to climate change adaptation and mitigation, and it's helped to build hydropower, solar and wind power stations in dozens of countries around the world, particularly the developing world, particularly the global south. All of this serves to highlight, among other things, the utter recklessness and short-sightedness of the new Cold War. If the US genuinely cared about protecting the planet and saving humanity, it would do everything possible to cooperate with China on climate change, learn from its example, benefit from its innovations. But actually it does the opposite. In support of its slander campaign regarding human rights in Xinjiang, it's imposing sanctions on Chinese products, including essential components for solar power. The people might want a Green New Deal, but what they're getting is better dead than red. It's difficult to avoid the conclusion that, in the interest of the survival of our species, the peoples of the world need to follow the example of the socialist countries to follow humanity's trajectory through pluripolarity to socialism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carlos. I think you froze there for a minute, and I suddenly thought it was the two Carloses that had difficulties in our panel today. And I should say that Carlos Ron could not get his video fixed, so he's just going to send in his written remarks, which we'll be posting soon. And we also have an offer to publish them all. So everybody keep your scripts. Right, so our final speaker today is Ben Norton. Ben is a journalist. I mean, I should say probably most of you know who Ben Norton is, but he's a journalist, writer, and filmmaker, founder and editor of the independent media outlet Multipolarista, where he reports both in English and Spanish. His journalism focuses primarily on US foreign policy and geopolitics, and he has reported from many countries around the world. He's currently based in Latin America. So Ben, please have the last word.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here and to speak after so many enlightening and important comments I heard from comrades from all over the world today. I think we should understand that the moment that we're living in historically is extremely important. It's become a cliche to say that we're in a watershed moment, but I truly think that is true. And in some ways, there are similarities to the situation during World War I, but there are also some similarities in the historical situation in the lead up to World War II in the 1930s. And I'll start with the latter. I think we're in a moment in which it's widely recognized throughout the imperial core that there is a fundamental crisis within the capitalist world system, that bourgeois liberal democracy is fundamentally in crisis and significant decline. We see living standards just plummeting in the United States, for instance. We've seen multiple generations now have lower life expectancies than their parents. We see that especially with the disaster of COVID, in which more than 1 million people died in the United States alone, that life expectancy decreased by several years, especially for marginalized and oppressed communities, Black Americans, Latinos, indigenous nations. And of course, we see in Europe a significant crisis. We see entire economies are being threatened with recession. We see industries in Germany are going to go bankrupt because of the economically suicidal policy in which Europe is trying to break off all of its economic relations and energy trade with Russia, basically in the span of a few months. And of course, this is a policy that is largely being pushed by US imperialism. In this moment of extreme crisis, there are two responses: socialism or barbarism. This is the exact crisis, the exact kind of analysis that Rosa Luxemburg discussed 100 years ago. The alternative routes are socialism or more barbarism. And I think at this moment, unfortunately, the reality, especially in Europe, is that barbarism, that is fascism, is significantly on the rise. And I think it's our responsibility as anti-imperialists and as socialists to articulate another path that recognizes the fundamental crisis within the current system, that recognizes that imperialist institutions like NATO and the European Union are not worth saving in this moment in which they are fundamentally in crisis. Because the reality is that we've seen an attempt to co-opt and exploit that anti-war sentiment that is quite popular among working people in the so-called West, in the imperial core, and try to direct that energy toward the far right. We see that with the very cynical rhetoric of people like Donald Trump. We see that also in Europe with people like Marine Le Pen and other far right leaders. So I think we also need to understand that while we're seeing this crisis within the imperialist bourgeois democracies, there's a fundamental crisis within the imperialist world system. And there is an unstoppable move toward the creation of a multipolar world. Of course, we see that US-led imperialism is trying to halt that through the creation of a bipolar world by waging a new Cold War. That is the point of this new Cold War. And we've seen extremely aggressive statements, not only from the most recent, the last two US presidents, Donald Trump and now Joe Biden, who have threatened war with China in order to support secessionism in Taiwan, who have imposed more and more aggressive sanctions on the People's Republic of China. We see now an economic blockade in Russia. But also at the same time, we see that within other parts of the global South that are moving toward this kind of multipolar world, there is a clear attempt to try to divide those forces among themselves. Especially we see this in the contradiction between India and China, and of course, India and Pakistan. So there are internal contradictions that are being exploited by imperialism. But I want to briefly highlight some comments that were made by the European Union. Of course, in this imperialist partnership led by the United States, the European Union is largely a junior partner in the imperialist world system dominated by the US. Increasingly, we see this now, especially with Europe becoming very heavily reliant on US energy exports, especially LNG. But at the same time, we also see that the European Union is a more than willing collaborator, and not just collaborator, a more than willing aggressor when it comes to being a willing participant in this imperialist world system. And we saw a speech that was given, a shocking, blatantly racist speech given by Josep Borrell, who's basically the foreign policy chief, the de facto foreign minister of the European Union. This was a speech he gave on October 13th at the inauguration of the ambassadors conference, the EU ambassadors conference in Brussels. He said that Europe is a beautiful garden and that we need to protect that garden from the evil barbarians in the rest of the world who are a jungle. This shows that this neo-colonialist mentality is still very much alive in the European ruling class. He said that the rest of the world is a jungle and they threaten to invade us, which is, of course, incredible projection, considering that Europe, the European colonial powers, have 500 years now of invading every corner of the planet, overseeing some of the most violent, murderous empires in history, and genocide and ethnic cleansing and mass slavery. So we see that this neo-colonialist mentality is alive and well. That speech did get some attention, but what was also interesting is 3 days before, Josep Borrell gave us another speech at the inauguration of this diplomatic academy in Brussels. And the tenor of that speech was quite different. That speech was we saw Borrell lamenting the decline of Western unipolar hegemony. And in that speech, he acknowledged that after the end of the First Cold War and the overthrow of the Soviet Union, the socialist bloc, he acknowledged that the imperial core's moment of prosperity was predicated on the subjugation of China and Russia. He said this very clearly in his speech on October 10th. I have a report on this. You can find the transcript at the official EU website. He says, "Our prosperity was based on China and Russia." That is an exact quote. Our prosperity was based on China and Russia. He acknowledges that it was based on the subordination of the Chinese economy and a captive market and cheap consumer goods from China, as well as cheap energy from Russia. that was being exported to Europe. And of course, that cheap energy is what allowed European economies to be competitive. And we see that now with the collapse of entire industries in Germany. So this is an acknowledgement by one of the players in the imperialist world system, the EU foreign policy chief, that this unipolar imperialist order, which also is codeterminate with the neoliberal system, neoliberalism being the phase of capitalism of US-led unipolar hegemony, of the unipolar hegemonic domination of the capitalist world system by the United States and Europe. And we see this acknowledgement that that system could only have operated based on the subordination of China and Russia, and of course the rest of the world. Now that China and Russia are no longer subordinated, now that they are independent powers, and by the way, now that they are strategic partners and building a new Eurasian bloc, we see this fundamental crisis within the capitalist world system and within the imperialist bloc led by the United States and Europe. And what is the response to that? The response to that is a drive toward global war, the US and Europe pushing the world toward World War III and the brink of nuclear apocalypse. And we also see a move toward fascism. And I'll just end with that note. I think that's the real danger that we need to grapple with. We're in this moment in which there is a fundamental institutional crisis of legitimacy, of bourgeois democracy, of capitalism itself. And there are two responses: socialism or barbarism. However, fascism has always portrayed itself, as Michael Parenti said, as a false revolution. It cloaks itself in revolutionary rhetoric against the so-called globalists, not the imperialists, the so-called globalists, which is of course very vague. It could be anti-Semitic. It could refer to liberals and people who support LGBT rights and who are against racism and feminists. It's very unspecific terminology that is used to co-opt this popular energy that recognizes that these constant imperialist wars have devastated the world and redirects that energy not against imperialism and capitalism, but against so-called globalism. Or they talk about the establishment, but they never define the establishment. They'll even say ruling class. We see Steve Bannon has talked about, he's railed against the ruling class, but he doesn't mean the capitalist class. So we see these charlatans, these sophists, who try to co-opt that popular energy and redirect it toward fascism, toward scapegoating LGBT people, scapegoating oppressed nations, scapegoating Black and oppressed nations, especially in the United States, Black people. I mean, we see an increase in white supremacy and white nationalism and so-called Christian nationalism being espoused by some of these fascistic US politicians. So I think it's our responsibility to articulate a firm line against imperialism and war, but also a line against national chauvinism, against bigotry, and against capitalism. And that is this, in this moment, it is completely necessary. It is extremely important because we see a fundamental crisis also within the left, especially in the imperial core, that is not dissimilar to the crisis that led to the split of the Second International in 1916. And in that sense, I said, you know, we're in a moment that's similar to the 1930s in the sense of the rise of fascism and the fundamental crisis within the imperialist world system and capitalist world system. But we're also in a moment that's not dissimilar to the 1914 and 1918 period, not because I think that this war that NATO is waging against Russia is an inter-imperialist war. It's not an inter-imperialist war. It's an imperialist-led war to prevent the consolidation of this multipolar world. NATO is waging a war on Russia to destroy BRICS, to prevent the consolidation of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, to prevent China and Russia from becoming a coherent political economic bloc that will offer countries in the global south an alternative path to economic development. That's the war that they're waging. It's not like World War I, which was fundamentally an imperialist war over the colonies. But we are in a moment that's not dissimilar to the 19-teens in the sense that there are large parts of the left, especially in the imperialist core, that have abandoned anti-imperialism and have actually given the far right an opportunity to recruit by saying that they're the ones who are against the so-called globalists, not the imperialists, when we see large parts of the left actually going along with imperialism, either tacitly or openly. So we need it is a struggle against both of those tendencies. the far right, but also against the opportunist parts of the left who don't support revolutionary defeatism, who see this war and say they want NATO, fundamentally the imperialist bloc, to win this war that fundamentally means the destruction of the attempt to build a multipolar world and the consolidation, further consolidation of this unipolar world that is, on its deathbed at this moment. So I can't stress how urgent that is at this historical moment. And fortunately, I think the work that you all do, and I try to do in organizations like the International Manifesto Group, cannot be more important in this critical historical moment. Thanks a lot for inviting me today.
Thanks so much, Ben. That was a really important and politically very relevant note to close on. So thank you very much for that. As I mentioned earlier, if there are members of the audience who would like to have a say, please use the raise hand function at the bottom of your Zoom window otherwise I may not be able to see you. So if there's anyone who would like to have a say, please go ahead and raise your hand. I only see one person at the moment. If there are, I will take Simon, and if there are any more, please do so now. Otherwise, we will bring the event to a close. Okay. Oh, I see. Simon has gone. Simon is no longer raising his hand. No, he is raising his hand. Are you? Yes.
Sorry.
Okay, I have 3 hands. Yeah, I have 3 hands.
Yeah.
I'll take all 3 in a row, and then we'll see if there are any more. And if not, then we'll bring the event to a close. So I have Simon, Kim, and then Kim and Ku, and then Russell Harland. So go ahead, Simon.
I would just like to point out that perhaps an opportunity. In some ways, it is fortunate that the US has launched a proxy war against Russia before it did so against China, because the liberal establishment has managed to paint Russia as this right-wing utopia, which I don't think is correct in the first place, but I think many on the right in the global north have accepted and identify with, and therefore oppose this proxy war. And by extension now, due to Russia's proximity to China, are coming around on the notion, on their position on China, the way they probably would not have if this was a proxy war against China. I think there would have been a lot more support against that. And I think there's maybe an opportunity there to engage, to bring back people from the right onto the left.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Kim, please go ahead.
Okay, I take to heart what one of the speakers talks about, moving from webinars to action. I think each of us in our own way need to work in where we are, using the manifesto and the various organizations that are attached or in unity with the peace movement, anti-war, anti-Cold War, for a communist, for a socialist revolution, as a guideline, as like, in other words, a strategic outlook on how we carry out our work in each of the areas that we're in. And it's like you say, it's very hard to have a universal organization, and the question of whether it's even possible to form something like a communist party in the belly of the beast like the United States, right? Given the fact that in the 60s, the new communist movement had failed to some extent miserably, but left a lot of older folks like us who have been part of the movement still believing in it. So I just want to point out that I agree that there is a need for the action, but each of us in our own way can use the manifesto as a guiding light, as a strategic kind of insight into how we practice. Thank you.
Great, a very important point, Kim. And Russell, please go ahead.
Good afternoon. Just going on to what Carlos Martinez said in his introduction, that there are a lot more people on this call who have more knowledge about geopolitics. I mean, that's clear. I mean, that could be clear, I suppose, but that's not really the point. I'm sure Carlos didn't mean it like that. The point I'm thinking of, how do we reach more people? Us working on the front lines with trade unions, how do we win over people who are good people, who are just trying to earn a living, who want to understand politics, but maybe don't have time for it? But at the flip side to that, how do we challenge bourgeois opportunists who it's been said throughout this whole sort of call, you know, are just sort of using it for their own benefit. So I think it's how do we reach more people and not create a distance that we or people on this call are more knowledgeable, because then it just embeds a gap between us and you know, the population who we need to win over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's also a very important point, and I think it's a bit of a struggle because, I suppose we have to create a dialogue, obviously, between us and them, as you rightly point out, and the more we can do so, the better it will be. If there are no further questions, perhaps we will bring our a wonderful webinar to a close for today. I will go to gallery view briefly, and yes, if there are no further questions or points, we will bring this wonderful webinar to a close. I hope everybody, all the speakers, have saved their scripts, and if you don't have a script, we will save the chat, the live transcript, and perhaps you can convert that into a proper script. Once again, let me share the IMG webpage where you can sign the manifesto, read the manifesto in many languages, consider donating, consider volunteering, and be part of our hopefully a growing organization. We hope to continue this. As many speakers have pointed out, this work is very important, and we have to put our shoulders to the wheel of political change. In the West in particular, which is without that such a malcontent and a malfactor in the world today. So thank you very much, and hope to see you all at our next events. One of our next events is, if you are a signatory and a member, you will receive an invitation to be part of a discussion about the upcoming US midterm elections. We have entitled it Oligarchy versus Oligarchy, which is essentially what's at stake in the US elections, and it will be a free discussion so that all people can participate in it, but it will be led by a short, brief 5-minute or 10-minute presentation by Margaret Kimberley, and the event will be moderated by Sarah Flounders. So that will be on the 30th of October. I hope many of you can be part of it, try to understand more the very complex scene in the US. And of course, you will be receiving further updates about our events, future events. So thank you very much for coming, and hope to see you all very soon.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.